Rain stitched across the kitchen window, turning the streetlights outside into fuzzy coins. Alan Pierce stood at the sink, waiting for the kettle to breathe, a hand pressed to the dull ache under his ribs. He'd worked too long in the garage, forgot lunch, then dinner, and now the room had a slow tilt, like a dock shifting with the tide. The whistle never came. The world blinked to black for a second, then to gray. His glass slipped, hit the tiles, and shattered into bright crumbs. He reached for the counter and missed. The floor came up hard. Somewhere far away a timer beeped, nearer, the refrigerator motor hummed like a tired animal. Alan tried to say help and heard only the dry scrape of air. Across the street, Ruth Klein stepped onto her porch to bring in a plant before the storm deepened. She saw Alan's kitchen light stutter, a shape vanish from the window, then nothing. She knocked once, twice, then used the spare key he'd given her after Lydia died. "Alan?" She found him on the tiles, eyes open but lost, breath shallow. She pressed 911 with 2 fingers that did not shake and talked to the dispatcher like she was reading measurements from a cookbook. The EMTs arrived fast, boots thudding in and out of her hearing as the rain grew louder. A young paramedic with careful hands, J on his badge, tucked a blanket around Alan and checked his pupils. "We've got you, sir," he said, not to calm him but to make a promise. "Dehydration, maybe syncope," the other EMT said as they lifted. "Let's go." Ruth rode up front, wringing rainwater from her sleeves. In back, Jay watched the monitor and talked to Alan as if the words were a bridge: name, age, what day it was. Alan answered most of them. When he couldn't, he watched the ceiling lights pass like pale moons. The ER held its own weather, bright, cold, clean. Nurse Carmen A. met the gurney at the door, hairpin tight, gaze gentle and exact. "Mr. Pierce, I'm Carmen. We're going to make you comfortable." She threaded the 4 like a needle through cloth, saline dripped, and the ache in his ribs loosened its fist. "Emergency contact," she asked. "My son. Ethan." He gave the number. The word son steadied him and then made him strangely light, as if a beam had been kicked from an old frame. Carmen stepped to the computer. 5:58 p.m., call 1 rang until voicemail. She left her name, the hospital, the words "your father is here." She tried again at 6:05, then 6:22. Each time her voice stayed calm, each time the line went to the same cheerful recorded tone: "Hey, you've reached Ethan." She wrote the attempts into the chart because that was what one did when facts needed a spine. "A message?" Alan asked, the words thick. 3, she said softly. "He may be driving." She checked his blood pressure again, small crease between her eyebrows, then smoothed the blanket the way people do when there's not much else to fix. Dr. Rowe swept the curtain aside, read the vitals, pressed 2 fingers to Alan's wrist. "Likely vasovagal with a dehydration component. We'll run labs, watch him a few hours." He nodded to Ruth. "Good thing you looked in." Ruth squeezed the bed rail. "You scared me, Alan. That plant will forgive the rain, I won't." The clock on the wall blinked to 6:31. Alan's phone lay on the bedside table, old case, cracked corner, a photo of Lydia tucked behind the plastic, her smile like sunlight pretending to be permanent. He reached for it and stopped. The room swayed once, then settled. He thought of Ethan at 12, asleep in the truck on the way back from the lake, sunburned and soft, of Ethan at 25, polished, busy, the phone always buzzing. He told himself there were reasons. He told himself to wait. Carmen checked his ID band and started a second bag. "I'll be back in 10, she said. "If you feel lightheaded, press that button." Alan closed his eyes, not to sleep but to listen, the beep of the monitor, the squeak of a cartwheel, the soft murmur of strangers caring because that's what they do. He did not plan anything then. He only held the fact that he had needed his son for an hour and the line had rung and rung into a cheerful nothing. Outside, rain hit the glass in clean, steady strokes, as if washing the day down to its truth. Downtown, the storm hadn't reached yet. The restaurant glowed with Edison bulbs and soft jazz, a curated kind of coziness that made people feel more important than they were. Ethan sat across from his wife, scrolling through a menu he barely read, his phone still buzzing on the table. He flipped it face down, the screen lighting up with an unknown number before vanishing. "Spam again?" Tessa asked, twirling her straw on her mimosa. "Yeah. They always call at dinner time," he said too quickly. The waiter arrived with waffles dusted with powdered sugar, bacon arranged like sculpture, and more champagne. Tessa angled her phone, framed the food, then lifted her glass. "Smile." Ethan shook his head, embarrassed. "Come on, Tess, every meal doesn't need an audience." "It does if I'm paying attention to the vibe." She snapped the photo anyway, her hand with its new gold bracelet just barely in frame. Caption ideas flickered through her mind like sparks. She wanted something witty, something that carried the sweet sting she specialized in. Then it came to her, sharp and careless as glass. Finally, a day without the nagging. She typed it, added a kiss emoji, hit post. The words slid into the stream of her followers, coworkers, old classmates, friends who loved her house updates. She imagined the likes rolling in like coins in a slot machine. Ethan caught the glow of the screen. "What did you just write?" "Nothing serious." She took a sip, eyes gleaming. "Just, we deserve some peace. You know how your dad always calls, always checks in, like we're still kids? I'm not saying I don't like him. But sometimes it's nice when it's quiet." Ethan hesitated. A moment ago, he thought about the call, the voicemail, the hospital he didn't want to deal with yet. He told himself his dad was fine. He'd always been fine. One faint spell didn't mean disaster. And brunch was important. Tessa hated when he broke plans. "Yeah," he said finally. "Quiet's good." Across the table, Tessa leaned back, satisfied. She didn't notice that Ruth had already seen the post from her kitchen window, her jaw tightening as she snapped a screenshot. Ruth typed a short message to Alan's phone, attaching the image. "You should see this." "I'm sorry." Back in the hospital, the notification buzzed against the nightstand. Alan reached for it slowly, his hands steadier than before. The words lit the screen like fire. "Finally, a day without the nagging." He read it twice, then a third time. His lips pressed together, a line so thin it nearly vanished. He didn't show Ruth. He didn't call Ethan again. He set the phone down, the glow fading into the dim room, but the sentence stayed behind, echoing. Nurse Carmen stepped back in with a clipboard. "Your son hasn't come yet?" Alan shook his head. His voice was low, even. "No. But he will." Carmen studied his face. Something in his calm unsettled her more than if he'd been shouting. She set the 4-line, jotted the vitals, and left him alone. Alan turned his gaze to the ceiling, where the fluorescent lights hummed like a hive. He could still hear Jay the paramedic's voice. "We've got you, sir." He thought about who had shown up when he couldn't stand, and who had not. The sticky note with call times lay folded in his pocket. The screenshot was saved in his phone. Quiet evidence. Quiet enough to wait. Outside, the rain finally reached downtown, tapping the restaurant's glass. Ethan checked his phone one more time, saw the missed calls, but pushed it back into his pocket. "Another mimosa?" he asked. Tessa smiled, clinked her glass against his. Neither of them heard the storm gathering in more ways than one. "You." The hospital quieted as evening pressed in. The cafeteria closed, lights dimmed in the halls, and the sound of rolling carts echoed like distant thunder. Alan lay propped against his pillows, the 4-line feeding calm into his veins. On the tray beside him rested his wallet, his phone, and a folded square of yellow paper. Carmen returned after her rounds, her steps steady, her face the kind of composed that comes from years of long shifts. "Vitals look good," she said softly. "If you keep stable, the doctor may discharge you tonight." Alan nodded, eyes drifting to the folded paper. "Nurse, could I ask you something unusual?" Carmen raised an eyebrow but leaned closer. "Of course. Could you write down the times you called my son? Just the attempts. In case I forget later." She hesitated. For your memory? For the record, he said simply. His voice had no anger in it, only the calm weight of someone laying bricks, one by one. Carmen considered him, then pulled a pen from her pocket. On the yellow sticky note, she wrote carefully. 5:58, no answer. Left message. 6:05, no answer. Left message. 6:22, no answer. Left message. She signed her initials at the bottom, CA, the way she would on a chart entry. She handed it to him. Here. But you should know, sometimes people miss calls. Doesn't always mean anything. Alan folded the note and slipped it into his wallet, behind the photograph of Lydia smiling in a summer dress. Sometimes, he agreed. After she left, he sat in the quiet, turning his phone in his hands. He opened it once more and saw Ruth's message waiting, the screenshot of Tessa's post, the caption glowing like a wound, finally, a day without the nagging. His thumb hovered, then closed the screen. He placed the phone face down. By the time Ethan finally arrived, the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain-soaked clothes. He carried a supermarket bouquet, lilies wrapped in paper, and arranged his expression into concern. Tessa trailed behind, lips glossed, her heels clicking on the tile. Dad, Ethan said, too bright. We came as soon as we heard. Alan's gaze lingered on the flowers, then shifted to his son's face. The nurses left 3 messages. Ethan faltered, then forced a smile. Phone was on silent. We were out. Tessa added quickly, we brought lilies. Thought they'd cheer you up. Her voice carried the lightness of someone who wanted to skip past unpleasant details. Alan accepted the bouquet with a nod. He did not mention the sticky note. He did not mention the screenshot. Instead, he placed the flowers on the counter, their fragrance oddly sharp in the sterile air. You can stay with us a few days, Ethan offered. We've got the guest room ready. No, Alan said quietly. I'll go home. Ruth will look in. There was a pause, a silence that pressed heavier than any thunder. Tessa adjusted her sweater, glanced at the envelope with hospital papers, then back to Ethan. He cleared his throat. If you're sure. I'm sure. As they left, Alan slid the folded sticky note deeper into his wallet, the evidence tucked safe behind Lydia's smile. He pressed the leather shut, his jaw tightening. Every piece was in place now, the calls, the post, the silence. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He only thought of what would come next, like a builder sketching lines before cutting wood. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled new, but inside Alan something older was taking root, steady and deliberate as oak. By 9:30 the 4 was out and the discharge papers were clipped to a small stack that smelled faintly of toner. Carmen buttoned his cuff with the gentleness people reserve for the very young and the newly shaken. Plenty of water, she said, then lowered her voice. And call if you feel anything strange. She glanced at the folded sticky note he'd slipped back into his wallet, then at his face. Take care, Mr. Pierce. Ruth drove him home in her old sedan, wipers thumping a steady metronome. The neighborhood was a dark quilt stitched by street lamps, every house looked asleep. In his kitchen, the shard glitter from the broken glass had been swept, a fresh towel draped over the chair, Ruth again, efficient as weather. When she left, he stood in the quiet and listened to the clock in the hall tick the seconds that no one could borrow back. On the table, he arranged 3 things, the phone with Ruth's screenshot of Tessa's caption, the yellow square bearing Carmen's neat initials, the smooth brass key to a safe deposit box where old deeds and Lydia's ring lived. He stared at them like a carpenter laying out a new build, measuring not wood, but consequence. At 10:58 he scrolled to Quinn and Marlowe. The line rang twice. Quinn, came a woman's voice, clear and awake in the way of people who live in crisis time. Miss Quinn, it's Alan Pierce. I need to change my will. Tonight. A beat, no surprise, only logistics. Can you be here in 30? I'll call the notary. Rain slicked the city in long diagonals. The downtown building's lobby was mostly glass and cleaning crews, the smell of lemon and wet umbrellas. Nadia met him in flats and a gray sweater over a blouse, a practical halo of hair pulled back. Her eyes took him in the way a good doctor's do, quick, total, respectful. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Black." They sat in a conference room that felt like the inside of a rain cloud, soft-lit, paneled with glass. A notary unfolded a seal, 2 administrative assistants in cardigans took seats with pens capped and ready, their presence quiet and official. Alan set the phone and the sticky note on the table like exhibits. Nadia read the screenshot without commentary, then the handwritten times, then looked back to him. "What outcome do you want?" she asked. "I want the math to reflect reality," Alan said. "If you mock an elder during a medical emergency, publicly, and if you ignore verified emergency calls, you don't inherit by default. The work goes to those who show up." Nadia nodded slowly. "We can draft an incentive trust with conditions precedent," she said, voice even. "Clarity is everything. We'll tie the condition to conduct within a specified period, to the emergency documented here." She tapped Carmen's initials. "And we'll define public ridicule as social media or any broadcast statement about you during the emergency window." "If the condition fails," Alan said, "the estate pours over to a charitable trust named for my wife, the Lydia Pierce Fund, for hospital equipment, scholarships for EMTs and nurses." "Good." Nadia typed. Rain whispered against the glass. Keys clacked with the certainty of nails set true. The notary watched, hands folded. One of the witnesses slid a dish of paper clips closer without looking up, a small courtesy that made the room feel less like judgment and more like repair. "Do you want any space for reinstatement?" Nadia asked without looking at him, the way one asks whether a door should swing both ways. Alan considered the question carefully, the word mercy drifting through like a remembered perfume. His jaw flexed. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight I need the truth on paper. Later, we can talk about what to do with regret." "Understood." She added a letter of wishes, not legally binding, but a map for those who would ask why. He dictated simply, because love isn't measured in promises made with dry hands, but in the people who held the weight when mine were shaking. At 12:41 a.m., the printer exhaled warm pages. Nadia arranged them in a neat stack, flipped to yellow flags where signatures would live. Alan signed in blue, the ink a small river. The witnesses signed. The notary pressed the seal until the page dimpled, a quiet bruise in the corner that meant the document could stand in a storm. Nadia slid a slim folder across the table. "Originals in our vault. Copies for you. We'll lodge the pour-over trust tomorrow. I'll also send certified notices to any named beneficiaries." He placed the folder beside his phone and sticky note, aligning edges. "Thank you," he said. He meant it in the deep way of men who prefer hammers to words, who recognize craft when they see it. Outside, the rain began to lighten. In the elevator, Alan watched himself in the stainless steel door, older than he felt, steadier than he expected. In the lobby, a janitor pushed a yellow cart, humming. On the sidewalk, the city smelled rinsed. He stepped into the wet and did not look back. The night had taken his anger and planed it down to something usable. Not fire. Allocation. He wasn't done building, he had just changed the blueprint. By Sunday evening, the storm had cleared. The sun dipped low behind the maple trees lining Allen Street, staining the windows gold. Inside his home, the kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil and clean wood, though a heaviness still lingered from that night on the floor. Alan set the table with deliberate calm, 3 bowls, bread in a wicker basket, silverware polished until it gleamed. At 6 o'clock sharp, a car door slammed outside. Through the window, he saw Ethan and Tessa walking up the path. Ethan carried a large plastic container of soup, his tie loosened as if to suggest a long day. Tessa's heels clicked against the porch, her pale sweater catching the last light. She carried another bouquet, roses this time, 2 red, almost rehearsed. Alan opened the door before they could knock. "Come in," he said, his tone warm but steady. He didn't hug them, Dad, Ethan began brightly, holding out the soup. Tessa made her chicken noodle. Thought it'd be good for you. Tessa smiled, tilting her head. Extra ginger. It's good for the heart. Alan took the container and set it on the counter. Thoughtful, he said, then motioned them toward the table. They sat, arranging themselves across from him. The candles flickered gently between them, shadows bending against the walls. As he ladled the soup into bowls, Alan's gaze lingered on Ethan. His son's smile was too careful, his eyes darting once to the envelope of papers tucked on the sideboard. Tessa noticed it, too. Her gaze flicked to it like a moth to flame, then quickly away. The conversation began with safe topics. Work. The weather. A new project Ethan had at the firm. Tessa described her kitchen renovation plans in glossy detail. All the while, Alan nodded, sipped the soup, tore bread into small pieces. He listened without interrupting, his eyes calm and unreadable. Halfway through the meal, he set his spoon down with deliberate precision. I met with Nadia Quinn this week, he said. The clink of Tessa's spoon against her bowl was just a hair too sharp. Your lawyer, she asked, her tone coated in surprise that sounded rehearsed. Yes, Alan replied. I decided to update my will. Ethan chuckled nervously. Dad, you've had that thing in place for years. Why all of a sudden? Alan leaned back, folding his hands. Emergencies have a way of showing you where the cracks are. I wanted to make sure the structure holds. The air grew still. Tessa shifted in her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her sweater though it didn't need smoothing. Well, she said lightly, I suppose it's wise to keep things current. Alan studied her, then turned to Ethan. We'll meet at Nadia's office tomorrow. All of us. She can explain the changes better than I can hear. Ethan nodded quickly. Of course. That's smart. But his throat worked as he swallowed, the word smart sitting strangely on his tongue. They finished the meal with more small talk, but the energy had shifted. The soup was hot, yet the room felt cold. Alan thanked them sincerely as he gathered the bowls. He even smiled when they left, waving from the doorway as though the evening had been no more than a quiet family dinner. When the door shut behind them, the house exhaled back into silence. Alan returned to the table, collected the candles, and placed the envelope on top of the sideboard where the flowers had been set. The roses looked too loud in the dim light, their red an accusation. He didn't move them. Instead, he picked up Lydia's framed photo, brushed a thumb over the glass, and whispered, blueprints almost ready. Outside, Ethan's car pulled away slowly, headlights cutting across the lawn. Inside the vehicle, Tessa spoke first, her voice low and sharp. What did he mean by changes? You saw the envelope. Ethan gripped the steering wheel harder than needed. We'll find out tomorrow. Neither of them noticed how steady Alan's silhouette looked in the upstairs window, watching until their car disappeared down the street. You said. The next afternoon, the air was sharp with early autumn. Alan arrived first at Nadia Quinn's office, dressed in a dark blazer and the same steady expression he had worn on the night of his collapse. He sat at the head of the polished oak conference table, hands folded, eyes clear. Ruth accompanied him quietly, a thermos of tea in her bag. She didn't speak, only offered the calm presence of someone who had once saved his life with a phone call. By 3 o'clock, Ethan and Tessa entered. Ethan's tie was knotted tight, his face composed but pale. Tessa wore her almond-colored coat and a smile that was too practiced, lips pressed to hide the tension in her jaw. She glanced at the neat stack of papers in front of Nadia and then quickly at Alan. Dad, Ethan said with forced cheer. Here we are. Alan only nodded. Nadia adjusted her glasses and tapped the folder. Thank you all for coming. Mr. Pierce asked me to update his estate documents following his medical emergency. Today, I'll read the revised terms aloud so there are no misunderstandings. The word emergency hung heavy in the air. Tessa shifted in her chair. Ethan leaned forward, trying to look engaged. Nadia's voice was steady, precise. Mr. Pierce has established an incentive trust. The terms are as follows: any named beneficiary must meet two conditions in order to inherit. First, that during the 12 months preceding Mr. Pierce's death, they must not have publicly ridiculed or disparaged him during a verified medical emergency. Second, they must have responded to documented emergency calls made on his behalf within a reasonable period. Ethan blinked. What does that mean? It means exactly what it says, Nadia replied calmly. She opened a folder and laid out two documents. Here is a note written and initialed by Nurse Carmine, recording 3 unanswered calls made from the hospital on the evening of Mr. Pierce's collapse. She placed the yellow sticky on the table, sliding it toward Ethan. And here, she continued, is a printed record of a social media post made by Mrs. Tessa Pierce on the same evening. The printout hit the table like a gavel. The caption glared in black ink, finally, a day without the nagging. Tessa's face went pale, then flushed hot. That was a joke, she snapped. A private little thing. Everyone posts like that. Nadia didn't flinch. It was public. It was during a documented medical emergency. Under the terms of this trust, that qualifies as disqualifying conduct. Ethan turned to her, eyes wide. You posted that? His voice cracked with disbelief, though guilt curled around his expression. He had known, even if he hadn't admitted it. Tessa's hand trembled against the table. It wasn't serious. You can't take everything away because of a joke. Alan finally spoke, his voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. A joke is only funny when it doesn't bury someone. Silence followed. Only the rain against the tall windows broke it. Nadia folded her hands. If these conditions are not met, the estate will not pass to the beneficiaries. Instead, all assets will pour over into the Lydia Pierce Fund, a charitable trust in your late wife's name, Mr. Pierce. It will provide scholarships for paramedics, nurses, and hospital equipment. Ethan sat back, his face draining. Tessa pressed her lips together until they whitened. Alan leaned forward, his eyes steady on both of them. When I fell in my kitchen, I didn't expect heroics. Just presence. Just for my son to answer the phone. He tapped the folder lightly. The paper doesn't lie. Neither do actions. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. The roses from Sunday still lingered in Alan's mind, their perfume cloying and false. Here, under the weight of truth, even those flowers wilted. For the first time, Ethan lowered his eyes and said nothing. The room felt colder after the last sentence. Tessa stared at the printed post as if the ink might rearrange itself into something kinder. Ethan's hands were clasped too tight, a white seam showing at the knuckles. Rain combed down the tall window in straight lines. Alan reached into his jacket and set a small black thumb drive on the table. There's something else, he said. His voice wasn't theatrical, it was workmanlike, the tone he used measuring a cut twice before he made it. For my kitchen. Nadia plugged the drive into the conference monitor. The screen came alive with a grainy angle of Alan's kitchen, the counter, the kettle, the glass slipping. The room in the video tilted as he did, then the hard jolt of tile. A beat of stillness. Then Ruth entering fast, calling his name, the blur of her phone, her coat draped over him without ceremony. The timestamp blinked in the corner like a metronome for a heart. Alan watched with everyone else, jaw set. Ethan leaned forward despite himself. Tessa's arms folded across her middle, as if bracing for a gust. The frame jumped to the paramedics arriving. Jay, the young one with careful hands, knelt into view and tucked a blanket around Alan with the practiced tenderness of someone who did this every day. We've got you, sir, his voice came through the tinny speaker, steady, warm, unshowy. The other EMT adjusted the monitor, called out vitals. The sounds were ordinary and exact, the language of people whose presence had weight. Nadia paused the video on Jay's face, eyes focused, mouth half open mid-instruction. The frozen image filled the room with a different kind of proof. That sentence, Alan said quietly, tapping the screen with one finger. It stayed with me. Not the napkins, not the flowers later. That. He turned to Ethan first, then to Tessa. I don't need grand gestures. I needed a person to show up when I fell. No one answered. Somewhere beyond the glass, a horn honked on the street and then the city went muffled again. Nadia clicked to a second slide, the title page of a trust document, clean type against white. The Lydia Pierce Fund. Below it, scholarships for paramedics and nurses. Hospital transport and equipment grants. Emergency responder support. This is where the estate pours over if a beneficiary fails the conditions, she said. It is funded immediately at your death, Mr. Pierce, and administered by a board, none of whom are family. Tessa let out a small, disbelieving laugh that died halfway. You'd rather give everything to strangers than to your own son? Alan didn't raise his voice. Those strangers picked me up off my floor. They learned my name. They kept it. He lifted the folder's edge and let it fall, a soft thud. Inheritance isn't a blood right. It's stewardship. If you won't carry it, I'll put it in hands that will. Ethan's throat worked. Dad, I should have come sooner. The words came raw, unpolished. I saw the missed calls later. I told myself you were fine. I told myself. Tessa had planned. He stopped, the excuses turning to dust as he said them out loud. Ruth cleared her throat gently, a sound like a hinge moved after long quiet. Sometimes we don't know who we are until something heavy needs lifting, she said. Then we find out. A soft knock. Nadia glanced at the clock. That will be Nurse Carmen, she said, and stood to open the door. Carmen stepped in wearing navy scrubs, hair damp from the rain. She nodded to Alan, to Ethan and Tessa, then to the table where the sticky note lay. You asked me to authenticate, she said, professional and kind. She took the note, turned it so the initials faced her, and spoke without adornment. I made these calls. I left those messages. Mr. Pierce was in a medical emergency at those times. Tessa's chin lifted, defiant and brittle. So what? We're on trial now. No, Nadia said evenly, returning to her seat. You're in a room where facts are being sorted. Alan closed the laptop. The blank screen reflected 4 faces and a rain-ruled window. He took a breath and placed his palms flat on the table, the way he used to when he ended arguments at the shop without shouting. The fund will carry Lydia's name into rooms where people are scared and alone, he said. It will buy a chair that rolls smoother, pay a semester for a nurse who will sit through the night. That is not revenge. That is correction. Ethan's eyes shone, not with tears yet, but with the first sting of their possibility. Is there any way back from this? He asked. It wasn't performative. It sounded like a man feeling, for the first time, the price of choosing convenience. Alan didn't answer immediately. He looked at Nadia. She held his gaze, then the slightest tilt of her head, an attorney's reminder that mercy, too, could be written. He returned his eyes to his son. Maybe, he said, each letter measured. But not with talk. The rain slackened. Somewhere in the building a vacuum hummed, and the scent of lemon cleaner rose faintly under the conference room door. The meeting wasn't over, but something had already been decided. In this family, from now on, love would be tallied not in promises but in attendance. The conference room was still, but the silence carried weight. Ethan's question, is there any way back from this, still hung in the air like a lantern no one dared touch. Tessa sat rigid, her arms folded, eyes flicking from the sealed documents to Alan's calm face. Alan didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, as though giving the words time to settle. Finally, he nodded once. There might be. But it would have to be earned, not claimed. Nadia tapped the edge of the folder, eyes thoughtful. Mr. Pierce, this is where we could add a reinstatement clause. A what? Tessa snapped, her voice sharp, brittle as glass. A provision, Nadia explained evenly, that allows a disqualified beneficiary the chance to restore part of the inheritance if they fulfill certain conditions. Not automatically, Mr. Pierce would have to agree at the time. But it gives a door, not a wall. Alan folded his hands. His gaze never wavered from Ethan. "Tell me what it looks like, Nadia." She adjusted her glasses and slid a page across the table. The clause could require documented service. Something tangible, measurable. For instance, 300 hours of verified volunteer work with vulnerable elders. Direct care, not photo opportunities. No social media. No posts. Just the work itself. The words landed like stones. Ethan sat forward, his mouth half open, then shut again. Tessa gave a sharp laugh. 300 hours? That's insane. You'd have him scrubbing old people's floors just to get what's rightfully his? Nadia's tone didn't change. No one is required to do it. But if they wish to regain access to the trust, this is the path. It ensures sincerity, not performance. Ethan's face tightened. He looked at his father, then away. 300 hours, he murmured. That's months of work. Yes, Alan said simply. That's what care looks like. Showing up, again and again, without applause. Tessa's hand shot to his arm. Don't you dare consider this. It's humiliating. Do you know how people would see us? We're not servants. Alan's eyes hardened, the first real spark of anger breaking his calm. Servants? He leaned forward, voice low but firm. The man who kept me alive that night served. The nurse who wrote those times served. Ruth, who ran into my house, served. That word you spit out as an insult is the only reason I'm sitting here breathing. Don't talk to me about humiliation. The words cut through the room. Tessa paled, but her chin stayed high. She muttered under her breath, "This is madness." Ethan pulled his arm from her grasp. His voice trembled, but it carried something raw. Maybe it isn't. Maybe this is what I need to do. Tessa's eyes widened, betrayal flashing across her face. You can't be serious. He didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at his father, truly looked, as if seeing him not as the stern figure from childhood, but as a man who had nearly died alone on the kitchen floor. If I do this, Ethan said slowly, if I show up, you'll consider reinstating me? Alan studied his son's face, searching for cracks between guilt and sincerity. Finally, he gave a single, deliberate nod. I'll consider it. But understand, this isn't about money. It's about whether you still know how to care. The rain had stopped outside. Through the tall windows, sunlight broke through clouds, spilling gold onto the polished table. The words had shifted something in the room, still tense, still heavy, but no longer hopeless. Tessa gathered her coat with a sharp tug, her voice icy. You're both insane. I won't let my life be dictated by chores. She shot Ethan a look that was part command, part ultimatum. We're leaving. But Ethan didn't move. He sat with his shoulders slumped, staring at the claws on the table as though it were both a punishment and a map. Alan watched quietly. He didn't push. He didn't plead. He only thought of Jay the paramedic's steady hands, of Carmen's initials on the sticky note, of Ruth's knock on the door. People who had shown up. Now it was Ethan's turn to decide if he could. The conference room emptied slowly, but the weight of the claws stayed behind, etched in the air like a doorway waiting to be opened. The first morning Ethan showed up at the Maple Care home, the parking lot was still wet with dew. He sat in his car longer than necessary, watching the staff file in with coffee cups and tote bags, trying to summon a courage he didn't recognize. Tessa had slammed the door behind her the night before, muttering about image and humiliation. He hadn't stopped her. Inside, the building smelled faintly of disinfectant and oatmeal. A volunteer coordinator named Marlene, gray hair tied back in a braid, handed him a clipboard. Name, she asked, brisk but not unkind. Ethan Pierce. She scanned him with the eyes of someone who could spot sincerity in under 5 seconds. No cameras, no phones on the floor. We're not here for posts. We're here for people. Understand? Yes, Ethan said quietly. His first assignment was humble, wiping down wheelchairs. The vinyl squeaked under the rag. His tie felt ridiculous, so he tucked it away. By the time he'd finished the third chair, his shoulders ached and his hands smelled like cleaning solution. Nobody applauded. Nobody even noticed, except a resident named Milton, who sat nearby in a faded baseball cap, squinting at a folded newspaper. "You missed a spot," Milton croaked, pointing with a crooked finger. Ethan wiped it again, forcing a thin smile. "Better?" Milton shrugged. "Good enough. You like baseball?" That was the beginning. Each visit after that, Ethan brought the sports page, reading box scores aloud while Milton corrected his pronunciations. "It's Altuve, not Altuve," the old man would bark, and Ethan would laugh despite himself. Soon, other residents started listening in, one woman asking for the weather, another for crossword hints. Days blurred into weeks. He cleaned, fetched tea, played cards. He learned how to adjust the footrests without pinching fingers, how to guide a walker through a narrow hall without making it feel like pity. None of it was glamorous. None of it was quick. But slowly, something shifted in him. One rainy afternoon, Ruth walked past the care home on her way to the grocery store. Through the glass doors, she spotted Ethan leaning forward in a chair, reading animatedly from the newspaper to a small crowd. No phone in sight, no forced smile. Just presence. She paused, watching long enough to feel the truth. This wasn't a performance. She told Alan later over tea. "He's there more often than not. Doesn't look like a man clocking hours. Looks like someone remembering how to be needed." Alan only nodded, his face unreadable, but his hand lingered over Lydia's framed photo longer that night. At the care home, Ethan didn't talk about inheritance. He didn't talk about money at all. The hours stacked up silently, logged by Marlene with her neat handwriting. By the third month, his tie stayed in the closet. By the fifth, Milton started calling him Kid, a title he hadn't earned in years. One evening, as Ethan wheeled Milton back to his room, the old man grumbled, "Why do you even bother, Pierce? You could be anywhere else." Ethan paused, then answered with an honesty that surprised even himself. "Because I wasn't there when it mattered." Milton didn't reply. But the next morning, Ethan found a folded note on the newspaper stand in shaky handwriting, "Thanks for showing up." When Alan visited the care home unannounced weeks later, he stood quietly in the hallway, unseen. He watched his son reading aloud, laughter from the residents filling the room. Ethan wasn't polished. He wasn't pretending. He was present. Alan left without being noticed, the faintest ghost of a smile on his lips. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if the door he'd left open was not just a punishment, but a path back. 300 hours. No cameras. No applause. Only the slow work of showing up. And Ethan, to his own surprise, was beginning to find something heavier than money in that silence. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Tessa scrolled furiously through her phone, her feed filled with photos of brunches, trips, friends posing in curated kitchens. But her own profile was strangely still. She had stopped posting after that night in Nadia's office, deleting the caption that had started it all. Finally, a day without the nagging, gone with a swipe. Yet the deletion didn't erase the echo. She sat at the kitchen island, tapping her nails against the counter as Ethan walked in, hair damp from another shift at the care home. His shirt smelled faintly of disinfectant, his sleeves rolled. "You went again," she said, not looking up. "Yes," he replied, dropping his keys in the bowl. His voice was tired but even. "You know how this looks?" Tessa snapped. "People are asking why you're wasting time. My mother called yesterday, do you know what she said? She said it's humiliating. That you're acting like a servant." Ethan froze, his shoulders stiffening. He remembered Alan's voice in Nadia's office, "That word you spit out as an insult is the only reason I'm sitting here breathing." "I don't care how it looks," Ethan said finally. "It's the first thing I've done in years that feels real." Tessa scoffed. "Real? You think reading baseball scores to strangers is real? What about us? What about the life we're building?" Building on what? He shot back, his voice sharper now. On ignoring my father when he needed me? On mocking him online? That wasn't life. That was performance. For likes. For followers. For nothing. Her face hardened, lips pressed into a line. You're really choosing this? Over me? Ethan's breath caught, but he didn't look away. I'm choosing to show up. For once. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Tessa grabbed her phone, slid it into her purse, and stood. Then you can live with your charity cases and your guilt. I won't. She yanked her coat from the hook, heels striking the floor like a gavel. The door slammed, the sound rattling the picture frames. Ethan stood in the stillness, his chest heaving. He didn't chase her. That night, he cooked a simple dinner for one, sitting at the table that suddenly felt too large. He thought of Milton's smirk, of Marlene's quiet nods when he finished a task, of the hours logged on the clipboard. He thought of his father watching from the hallway, though Alan had said nothing. For the first time, Ethan realized Tessa hadn't just mocked his father, she had mocked the very idea of care. And he had let her. The divide widened in the days that followed. Tessa moved in with her sister. The house grew emptier, but Ethan filled the hours at the care home. No applause, no cameras, just work. One evening, Milton looked up from his crossword and grunted, "She gone?" Ethan managed a small smile. "Yeah." Milton studied him, then shrugged. "Good. You show up more when you're not dragging dead weight." Ethan laughed softly, the sound half sad, half relieved. In another part of town, Alan sat at his kitchen table with Ruth, sipping tea. She had seen the moving truck outside Ethan's house and raised an eyebrow. Alan only said, "Sometimes what divides you is exactly what teaches you who you are." Ruth studied his face. "And what does it teach you?" Alan set his cup down, fingers resting on the rim. "That sometimes losing is the only way back to what matters." The words lingered in the quiet kitchen. Outside, the evening deepened, but inside Alan felt something shift, a blueprint coming together, piece by piece. His son was not done yet. Neither was he. A year had passed since the night Alan collapsed on his kitchen floor. The seasons had wheeled from rain to summer heat to crisp autumn and back again. Through it all, Ethan had kept going to Maple Care Home. At first, every visit felt like a punishment measured in hours. But somewhere between cleaning wheelchairs and reading Milton's box scores, the work had reshaped him. The guilt that had burned hot at the start had cooled into something steadier, responsibility. On a cold evening in late October, Ethan sat at his desk with a thick envelope in his hands. Inside were letters, neatly signed supervisor reports from Marlene, attendance logs, and personal notes from residents. One in shaky handwriting read, "Thanks for showing up, kid." Another from Marlene, "Mr. Pierce completed 312 hours of direct service without public recognition. He has shown consistency and sincerity." Ethan traced the words with his thumb before sealing the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should, like it carried not just time but proof. The next morning, Nadia Quinn's office was bright with pale sunlight when the receptionist accepted the envelope. "For Ms. Quinn," Ethan said quietly. Don't tell my father yet." Nadia opened it later at her desk. As she read the letters, her lips pressed into something between approval and relief. She called Alan that evening. "He's completed the hours," she said. "Documented. Verified." Alan sat at his kitchen table, Lydia's photograph beside his tea. He stared at the grain of the wood, silent for a long moment. "Did he do it for the class?" Alan asked softly, "or for himself?" "I can't answer that," Nadia replied. "But I can tell you he did the work. Every hour. No shortcuts." That night, Alan didn't sleep much. He thought of his son as a boy, falling asleep in the truck after fishing trips. He thought of him as a man, tie knotted, phone buzzing, too busy to answer when it mattered most. And he thought of Ruth's words, "Sometimes losing is the only way back to what matters." The following week, Alan drove to the care home unannounced. The hall smelled of lavender cleaner and stew. In the common room, Milton sat in his usual chair, cap pulled low. Ethan was beside him, leaning forward, animated as he read aloud the sports page. Residents chuckled at his stumbles, groaned at the scores. No phone in sight, no eyes glancing at a clock. Just presence. Alan stood in the doorway, unseen. His chest tightened, not with anger this time, but with something he hadn't felt in years, cautious hope. Later that evening, he called Nadia. "Restore a portion," he said. "How much?" she asked. "Enough that he knows he still belongs to this family. But not enough that he forgets what belonging costs." When Ethan received the call from Nadia, he was silent for several seconds. He agreed. "Partially," she confirmed. "The rest remains with the Lydia Pierce Fund. It's his way of saying you've begun to mend the crack, but the scar will always stay." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of both loss and grace pressing into him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entitled. He felt humbled. That Sunday, Alan and Ethan sat across from each other in the same kitchen where it had all begun. The kettle hissed softly. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Alan said, "I saw you. With Milton." Ethan's eyes widened. "You were there?" Alan nodded. "It wasn't for me, was it?" Ethan swallowed. "No. It was for them. And, for me." Alan's gaze softened. He lifted his cup. Then maybe it was enough. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was the kind of silence that holds space, for forgiveness, for change, for something not finished but beginning again. The hospital lobby was bright with balloons and chatter on the day of the dedication. Nurses in pale blue scrubs stood beside administrators, a ribbon stretched across the entrance to the new transport wing. A gleaming chair sat under the lights, sturdy and modern, its metal polished like chrome. On the side was a small silver plaque. Lydia Pierce Fund. Finally, a day when someone showed up. Alan stood at the front, his blazer pressed, Ruth at his side. Carmen was there too, smiling in quiet pride, and Jay, the young paramedic, shifted awkwardly under the attention of a few reporters. Alan shook his hand firmly. "You didn't just save me," he said. "You reminded me what presence means." Jay looked startled, then nodded. "Just doing my job, sir." Behind them, Ethan lingered near the back of the crowd, hands clasped, no wife beside him. His tie was slightly askew, his eyes hollowed by months of work but clearer somehow, as if he'd shed a layer of pretense. When the speeches ended, he stepped forward, hesitant. "Dad." Alan turned. His face stayed calm, but not cold. "I've been volunteering still." "Even after the hours," Ethan said, voice low enough not to carry. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know." Alan studied him, the lines around his mouth deep. Slowly, he nodded. "I know. I saw it in the way you carried Milton's paper last week. You weren't counting minutes anymore." Ethan's throat tightened. "I was wrong. That night. All of it. I know that too." Alan's eyes softened, though the firmness never left his voice. "Regret doesn't change the past. Showing up does." Ruth touched Alan's arm lightly, reminding him the ribbon waited. Alan cut it, the crowd clapped, and the new wing officially opened. Cameras flashed, but his gaze lingered on his son, who stood apart from the applause, shoulders lowered, as if he was still learning how to bear the weight of humility. Later, when most had gone, Alan and Ethan walked together through the new hall. Nurses tested the chair, wheeling it smoothly along the polished floor. "Will you ever forgive me?" Ethan asked quietly. Alan stopped, his hand brushing the plaque. "Forgiveness isn't a switch, son. It's a habit. Same as showing up." He looked directly at him. "You keep showing up, and forgiveness will take care of itself." Ethan blinked hard, nodding. "I will." They stood in silence a moment longer, the chair gleaming between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. That night, back at his house, Alan sat at the oak table where the blueprint of this revenge had first taken shape. The sticky note was still tucked in his wallet, Lydia's smile and the photograph above it. He thought of how every piece, Carmen's initials, Ruth's knock, Tessa's post, Ethan's silence, had led here, to a fun that would outlive him, to a son learning the cost of care. He whispered softly to the empty room, as though Lydia might still hear him, "They're regretting now. But maybe regret is the beginning of something better." Outside, the rain began again, light and steady. Not a storm this time. Just enough to wash the air clean.